Welcome, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the first episode of the Holistic Underground podcast. And here we're going to be talking to people. We get to have conversations with folks that are leading lives today that reflect the future that we need to be creating. And it feels so perfect to get to start this whole thing off with, one of my podcast idols, someone who mixed one of my favorite podcasts, Scott Ferreter. One of my dear brothers. You're often around for firsts for me.
Hmm.
So no big surprise to have you. And I think the best way I could introduce Scott is Scott is an incredible musician. He's half of the Feelings Parade, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment, but is more than just a band. It's really a movement. There's a whole community of feelers, people who are coming around this music and coming together to live a life that is really present and really alive. But one of the songs that Scott wrote called What Peace, and I would love to hear you talk about where that song came from for you. But that song was my ringtone for at least 6 months, if not a year, in some of the hardest times of my life. And I would wake up to that song and cry a lot in the mornings. So to tell you a little bit about who Scott is, I used to actually often introduce Scott as the person I cry with the most. I'm at his house and he's sleeping in another room. And so I got to have Scott's bed and I wake up to What Piece, the song, to my ringtone. But it's not the ringtone, it's Scott playing the song and serenading me awake. So that's a little bit about who Scott is. And how he nourishes the people in his life. And besides that, Scott has the Feelings Parade and is a full-time musician and artist, which is awesome. Someone I look up to a lot in that regard. Is part of steering the Orchard, which is a beautiful community house where a lot of amazing events are happening. It's where I get to do most of my favorite things I've ever done. My birthday party I hosted there. Part of You're Gonna Die, part of the You're Gonna Die podcast, which I highly recommend people checking out. And I know you also are doing this work in prisons. You're really bringing this work about poetry and art to help us see that not only we're gonna die, but we're alive right now.
Hmm.
And lastly, I could not go without mentioning your deep roots in men's work and all kinds of different healing modalities. So ladies and gentlemen, Scott Ferreter, great guy we have to talk to here. So, Scott, I want to start with this question that just feels like a way to really open us up, which is, what have you been? Take your time with this question. You take a deep breath. We got some really patient listeners here. What have you been through that has prepared you to be who you are in these times?
Mm.
What have you been through that has got you ready? Because you've been showing up.
Mm. What a great question. The first thing that comes to mind is actually an ongoing force in my life as long as I can remember. And I think this is a common experience for a lot of dreamers and visionaries and artists. Um, I've always held a tension between the way things are and the way they could be. And it's made it so that for a lot of my life, haven't taken things for granted as being like, oh, that's just the way life is.
Mm-hmm.
That's just what it's like to be alive, or that's just what it's like to try to make ends meet.
Mm-hmm.
Things that are convincing facades in our society about the way things are. For whatever reason, from the time I was little, I feel like I had this ability to kind of see through it. See, like, okay, we're doing this, we're playing this game,
Mm-hmm.
we're creating this reality, but come on,
Mm-hmm.
come
Mm-hmm.
on. Like, really,
Yeah.
there's a lot more possible.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think that people who tend to think in that way kind of hold in an ongoing way a certain kind of grief
Hmm.
about the instability of things and the
Hmm.
impermanence of things.
Hmm.
And I do think that in times like these, some people, the same way that with death, we're taught to ignore it, ignore it, ignore it until somebody you know and love dies.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, you're not just grieving that person, you're waking up to a life of loss. And
Yeah.
all of a sudden, you're grieving your previous notion that things lasted.
Yeah.
So we have to grieve those two things at once in that situation. I think that in this moment, I feel like a lot of people are like shocked by the discovery of instability and the discovery of things not being lasting. And
Hmm.
I'm definitely not above that. I've had many days of like crawling under the covers and especially like noticing the little kid in me just being like, wait, 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 what
Yeah.
happened to the way things were?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of me has been really prepared by having an imagination for other ways that we could construct our lives, other ways that things could be put together that isn't what we've known.
Hmm. One of the things I love about you, Scott, and I comes to me right now is you really don't shy away as much as you don't shy away from going as far into the. I've seen you pull some rabbits out of the hat, with different ways of doing things as an artist, different ways of relating to the money exchange between artists and their audience, different ways of doing a tour. Like, me and so many others, just kind of follow your scripts. You and Morgan, both are a brilliant team. And you also, both of you, the Feelings Parade and a lot of the artists that you work with, you're not afraid to lean into heartbreak,
Mm-hmm.
not afraid to lean into the dissatisfaction with the status quo. And I actually have always really admired that about you. I last the first interview I did, we ended up talking a lot about death, and we talked about how the proximity to death. I actually got to interview a childhood friend. She was my sister's best friend when I was 11.
Mm.
Um, and we got to, so she was actually there, with my family when my mom passed away. And we got to really have this beautiful conversation about how proximity to death and proximity to these things, they prepare us for these kinds of things. You like you said, um, they get us used to the veils going up.
Yeah.
Um, but I guess kind of in that same vein, I'm curious, um, how have you taken this tension that you hold, and how have you taken, what you've been through to to and what new have you found that has made you resilient right now? And I want you to share this because we're in the middle of a global pandemic. Whenever it is that you listen to this, this is April 9th, 2020, right?
Mhm.
And I know we all dove into 2020 head first, but anyway, what's been keeping you resilient these days?
Yeah. Mm. For me, the like deepest roots that I've found lately have come from realizing how much has not changed. Zooming out and looking at the big arc of
Mm,
life
mm,
and going back to other times, other civilizations. I mean, I'm in Oakland right now, like Oakland 30 years ago, right here. The amount that has changed and the extent to which change has always been something that humans are needing to grapple with over the course of a lifetime, over the course of generations, over the course of
mm,
civilizations,
mm,
over the course of a day.
mm,
Um, there is a sensationalism that I
mm,
feel a gravity toward, and definitely a collective gravity toward, um, I think that it's so crazy to be a human being. The experience is so intense that it's always really validating when we can have like forces outside of us saying like, oh no, for real, this is definitely crazy right now, this is unprecedented.
yeah, this is nationally crazy.
Right, this is like internationally crazy, this is like
Yeah.
like you're not crazy, this is
Mhm.
crazy. um And I actually think there's like a deeper place to send our roots into, yep, I come from
Mm,
generations and generations and generations and generations of people figuring it out, of
mm,
people making sacrifices based on the best that they can do or the
mm,
best that they're seeing.
mm,
And, you know, I think it has its time and its place to recognize, like, oh my gosh, this is unprecedented.
mm,
And it's not so crazy that it's time to like throw out everything we know about living and throw out all of our practices that serve us or
mm,
completely change our priorities. Um,
mm,
in so many ways, for me, I feel like my resilience right now is coming from just like, yep, this is time to kind of double down on what I already know to be true.
mm,
I don't need to throw out everything I've learned and throw out all the practices that serve me. It's like, oh no, now is actually the time to like really double down on those and let them nourish me.
yeah. Mm. I love, when he said unprecedented times, it just, I had this funny thought, like as if the times were precedented before,
Exactly.
like
Exactly.
we shifted from precedented times
I
into
know, right?
unprecedented times. Um, and I really, really appreciate, there is such a need for that zoom out.
Mm-hmm.
For me, one of the things that did it was just thinking about like, when was the last time the whole world did something together?
Mm-hmm.
Like, kind of moved as one species, so to speak. Like the whole
Yeah.
world was up to something,
Yeah.
like consciously. And I couldn't think of anything before, like after World War II.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of the last time the whole world was like up to the same thing, and that one,
Yeah.
that was bad. Like that, 77 million people died, which, thank goodness. And like, I do not want to, I'm glad, like even the worst of the scientific
Right.
predictions about what COVID could do is wouldn't touch that. Thank heavens. But it is beautiful how, I guess like what you're saying is we're getting practice changing everything
Mm-hmm.
real quick.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm. Is there, you're talking about the, this tension between the way things are and the way they could be. I'm just kind of curious, like if you were a novelist and you were just
Mm-hmm.
writing a story, and you know today was the end of the first book, and you were kind of just starting to brainstorm the sequel. I mean, what would be an amazing? What are some of the things you've seen are possible?
Mm.
And what do you? And maybe even what do you hold on the horizon,
Yeah.
for where we could go from here, for what this could be for us,
Right.
if we let it, if we shaped this time.
Yeah. I see, you know, I spoke earlier about some like the common experience of people not only having to grieve a loss,
Mm,
but also like waking up to impermanence at the same time. Um, my prayer for all of this has been that this disrupts people's certainty around the way we spend our time and where our priorities are. Um, and I'll say that for myself, to watch the global economy slow the fuck down for some purpose other than the global economy, and to have that purpose be human life,
hmm, hmm, yeah.
I wasn't expecting to get to see that. I'm so used to watching human life bear the brunt of what the economy needs, and watching this much slow down and change in the name of life and in the name
Right,
of well-being.
right.
I want this, and you know what I'm hoping book two is all about is what changes inside of people when they have the experience of, oh, all of it can slow down, all of
Yeah.
it can stop, because
Mhm.
even with more like revolutionary, visionary, hopeful thinking, there's a difference between being able to be like, something in me knows that we could change direction or change momentum or slow down and turn the other way. There's a difference between that and actually having experienced it start to
Yeah.
happen.
Yeah.
And that's my hope, is that creates a new place for those like roots of hope to go when we talk about what could change and what could shift. I know there's been a lot said about how much money is suddenly available for the federal government to pull together.
Yeah.
And it's like 4 months ago, every time Bernie brought up those numbers,
Yeah.
it was just like laugh him off the stage. Like,
Yeah.
where would that come from?
Right.
And so, not just there, but just in our everyday lives and at the city level and state level and global level, people having a sense of like, oh, this thing is steerable.
Yeah.
Finally had something so important come up.
Mhm.
Whereas like we saw the iceberg of like, oh, here's how much death. And we started steering the ship
Yeah.
intentionally. And that alone, this sense that like we actually can make pretty sharp pivots.
Yeah.
That's the thing that so many of us have been like trying to like continue believing in.
Yeah.
When we talk about climate change, like
Yeah.
that's what we need to have faith in, that a sharp pivot is possible.
Right. 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 It's so funny because you say this and I'm like, I've basically been like dreaming of the day that this economy slowed down
Right.
for decades, really. Um, and it's funny. Well, 2 decades. I'm not that old, but I mean, I gotta say, you're rocking my world a little bit, Scott, because um, I'm now seeing that a lot of what I've been going through is been grieving. Like I never would have thought I'd find myself crying because our economy, as I knew it, was ending. I was
Yeah.
like, all the small bit, like
Yeah.
I guess what you're sharing is like this is like that first death,
Yeah.
that first grieving that wakes us up, and it just makes me also think about as far as death. It's like um, for a lot of us, a lot of the world, and this is one of the kind of disparities, not just in how the government treats people who are during this kind of response, but how people respond. If we look at just the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan and the things that are happening in different parts of China, and this many people dying is a very normal part of our story today.
Yeah.
But now everyone has access to see the iceberg
Yeah.
that you just described, and it's yeah, I guess I'm just feeling really moved um, to look at that, right? Like this is kind of what it takes to wake us up, all of us.
Yeah.
A lot of people, if you live in Gaza,
Mm-hmm.
You probably already were like, yeah, this world, the system is not working,
Right.
right? But now in Oakland
Mm-hmm.
and in San Francisco and in Sweden and in all the places where it's just been so safe and steady. I almost feel like I'd never wish death upon anyone,
Mm-hmm.
and I would never wish someone to have to experience death. And I also know that anyone who hasn't is, in for a wild ride until they do. And once they do, their life has this opportunity to really open up.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for holding it that way.
Yeah. And for me, that way of holding it makes no sense and would feel really incomplete and false without the piece that you're talking about. And my whole life I've been unusually committed to small businesses. I've taken it was like early on I got the picture, like 13 years old, like, oh, if I bike across the street to the little electronics store, like I'll still get to go to that electronics store in my like 20s and 30s versus I don't like how I feel when I walk into a Best Buy. And I didn't even have like really a story for why. I just knew like that's not what I want. And then I walk into a little mom and pop electronics store and I'm like, yeah, that feels good. Like I know them, they're characters. I never liked talking to him, but even just knowing that there's
Yeah.
something like, yeah, that guy, right? Like
Right.
it's village, it's togetherness, it's codependence, and that's been like one of the major things I've been grieving right now. And like there's no way to talk about the way we've constructed this ship
Yeah.
without like acknowledging like when we pivot, guess who we're pivoting on.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
And
so yeah, I can't name that. Like it's the steering of the ship is a gruesome
yeah.
display of inequality and
Yeah.
injustice. And that's the way this ship has been built. And
Yeah.
I don't know that it would be my place to say like there couldn't be a pivot without that injustice like showing its like
Yeah.
hideous nature. But I do know that what we're living through right now is absolutely a pivot
Yeah.
on the very people who I would want to see having less being put on them.
Yeah.
And we're in this situation where it's like, nope, that's who's bearing the brunt of this.
It's what what's fascinating about what you're saying too is I'm seeing a direct correlation. I'd love to hear what you have to say about this, because uh, there's a reason I chose you to lead the European descent folks ritual
Mm-hmm.
on my birthday. I did this kind of event for people of African heritage to come together and dance and heal, and then the second half of the event we invited everyone else to join. And before that, I wanted my white friends to have a space to kind of come together and talk about their juicy goodness, so that they could kind of tap into that and come to the dinner table with a full plate,
Mm-hmm.
to offer the potluck. And it really was you and Zahava did a great job with that. But I'm really seeing like kind of like the proximity to death thing,
Mm-hmm.
the response of people who have been sheltered from reality.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, frankly, the level of anxiety and the
Mm-hmm.
level of fear,
Mm-hmm.
and it's all necessary. I feel like there are people who really freaked out when this went down, and they kind of helped to ring the alarms, because I'll even say it like this: a lot of my Black friends was like, I mean, like, we've been through a lot, like I'm not worried about this virus, in Africa, and people are like, oh, I think we're immune. I think, people will say all kinds of things, because
Yeah.
the reality is, if you've developed such a high level of resilience because of what you've been through,
Mm-hmm.
um, and I think that there's, we're balancing each other. There's people who are calling for the response that we need to have, and there's people who are calling for the emotional response that we need to have, which is one of like, freaking out is not going to help us here. Anyway, all this to say, the people who are getting pivoted on economically,
Mm-hmm.
I think also have a lot to teach us about how to respond to this emotionally and creatively.
Yep.
Like all the like funny rap songs, all the meme songs that I see coming out about like, the COVID clap, and all these different
Yeah.
things. People are just like, all right, like, we struggling, let's make music,
Yep.
Um, so yeah, thank you, man. This is great to look at that.
Yeah.
If you don't mind, I want to just do a little pivot right now.
Yeah. Great.
In our last couple of minutes together here, and just talk to you about the themes of some of this music.
Yeah.
Because you mix the music, you record,
Mm-hmm.
you were the recording engineer. We recorded it in your bedroom.
Did.
So and I don't know if you know this, but for anyone, the song "Giving Up on Us," basically I wrote that song after a kind of man-to-man, check-in buddy, accountability buddy talk with Scott, where he was like really helping me see, it's like, hey man, like, is staying in this relationship with this person really in your or their best interest, you know. And I don't know if you knew that, but that song came out of
Mm.
that wake up call you helped me have. um so you're deeply woven,
Mm-hmm.
really really deeply woven. So one thing I wanted to hear from you is, you know, let me put it this way. You passed some medicine on to me
Mm-hmm.
in that conversation that had me write that song and had me take that action of lovingly and compassionately ending this relationship, and still till this day being a deeply loving and wonderful
Mm-hmm.
friendship with that person. um where'd you get that medicine? What'd you go through?
Mm.
What was the mess that brought the, you know, what was the mess that brought the lesson in, about relationships? And is there something about, you know, death having a seat at the table, the death of the
Yeah.
relationship, you know? Because that's what I really think I've learned from you a lot is, you know, you treat your relation, you don't take them for granted.
Yeah.
And yeah, where did the medicine come from? What
Yeah.
did you distill, uh to bring that out for me? And what came out of it?
So sweet to hear you say that you experience me as someone who doesn't take them for granted because, you know, as it tends to go with the things that we like end up digging into a lot, like I don't necessarily see myself that way.
Mm.
And that's such a, like, I've seen that pattern so much. You know, it's like because I care so much about not taking people and relationships for granted, it makes it so that when I slip, when I do, it hurts so deeply that it
When
really
you tell
made.
yourself you slip.
Yeah, well, yeah, thanks.
Love
So,
you.
yeah, um, I mean, before, and it would have been really sweet if Morgan could have been here. Um, my romantic partner in the music, and certainly, you know, when you were talking earlier about uh, the way that we've structured things that have created new paths as far as relationship to creativity and money and how those two connect with community, like so much of that credit goes to Morgan. Um, when she and I got together, um, I was coming out of uh, a 6 year long relationship. And in that relationship, I did what I think is a really natural, at least natural for people who've been raised with the stories that I was raised in. But the
Mm.
very natural thing of kind of like playing that game of like, is this the one? And without a doubt, at that moment in my life, that person was the one.
Mhm.
There's just that fullness to it. There's just that like it was one of the first times in my life where I had the experience of like all of a sudden no other romantic interests, like I can't even think about anyone else, right? I just had that level of fullness. And then the life that we created together and the way we showed up for each other and the way that she was with me when my dad died and the way that we navigated long distances and then coming together, um, we became adults together. We
Mm.
went from being kids to being adults together. And
And y'all
all,
just take
yeah,
note, everybody. He's talking about his ex. Just take notes. This is how you want to hold your ex in your mind, right? This is
yeah,
beautiful. Thank
yeah.
you.
I mean, it's like when I played the game of there's in love and there's out of love, it would have, and it did when I did that, it would fry my circuits. Cannot compute because simultaneously, she and I were both at a certain point getting a crystal clear message. This isn't what we're supposed to be doing.
Mm.
This isn't meant to be carried through into the next chapter of our lives.
Mm.
for us, I had built, and we had built so much into the future that the only way I feel like we could even make sense of that was to like really repeat to ourselves a lot, like, for now. We're getting a very clear message that for now, this needs to shift. This needs to be done in the way that it has been, and who knows about the future. And the grief that I had to experience untangling my own future, the future of my life, with all of my expectations about someone else's involvement in it, was a really, for me, clear wake-up call to like, I can love someone right now, and I can show up for them right now, and they can be X, Y, and Z for me right now. And it is not information that I'm privy to what that's going to look like in X amount of years. And the whole story that it's about how much you love them, I got to firsthand have the just like, nope, wasn't about how much we loved each other. Because if it was about how much we loved each other, then happily ever after, you know?
Sound bad.
Yeah. And so to separate those two, for me, like, created that new way of relating to it. And like, you know, it is like an energy. You spoke about having a death, like set a seat at the table for death. The death of the relationship, same thing. Like, don't have a breakup be something that's just like not spoken about, and kind of like you make inferences about it as if it would be the worst thing ever. Like,
Right.
talk about it up front. Have it be something that like, hey, if we were to separate this and this, or, you know, and this comes up between Morgan and I, like, we've both hit boundaries and hit limits with each other where we're like, if this particular thing were to keep going indefinitely or to get worse, we would need to separate, because I know I'm not going to like let that be my life. We've both done that for each other. And actually there's kind of a like, it's like the cold water of truth. You know, it's actually not just pain on the other side of that. There's a little bit of like, oh, good. I'm glad I'm dealing with someone who's going to take care of themselves and who prioritizes their own well-being over this entity that we've created together.
Yeah.
And the reason we would want to be in this relationship is because it serves our well-being. And so it's healthy and super important to name like, oh yeah, if this stops serving my and our well-being, we'll end it. And we'll do it in the best way we have available. And that doesn't need to be some like mysterious force. Just like crystal clear, like, yep, we're not aiming for it. And we both know that we're aiming for as much of this togetherness as we could do, but certainly not at the expense of our relationship to our soul, our relationship to music. And that was really an interesting one for the two of us. We both came together kind of like, hey, just so you know, I'm already married to music. So, and
hope you're down for you know, polygamy and polyamorous,
yeah, totally,
non-monogamy, because I've already got a life partner in these songs.
Yep.
Oh, man.
And it was actually really relieving that we both had that same relationship with it. There was a real exhale and like, oh, good, yeah, neither of us is like interested in prioritizing the relationship above our life.
Yeah.
Well,
I'm so glad that for myself and anyone listening that we got to have this conversation, given what's happening right now, because boy, do we need to live with that level of right now with the people we love once we can see them again.
Yep.
You know, for everyone who doesn't live with their partner and, you know, is practicing social distancing, for me, you know, in my friendships and relationships, it's like, I would not have guessed that such a thing could keep me from the people that I love, from being with them physically, right? Like, I'm glad we have Zoom and WhatsApp and all the things we can just keep in touch with, but it's like, damn.
Yeah.
Like I'm
Yep.
so glad that for every moment that I really spent with you.
Yeah.
Um, I guess, yeah, it's not just this like, oh, it could never happen thing called death.
Mm-hmm.
That might, we just don't know. So
Yep.
Scott, I've just been looking forward to this conversation,
Mm-hmm. Me too.
and for a good reason. And I hope to have you back because we just kind of scratched the surface of some of the magic that I know you've got brewing in that room over there.
Mm-hmm.
And before we close out, I just wanted to, I know you have this project coming out.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I've had just such an honor of having this album really move me and change my life, um, because it got to be the soundtrack for such a pivotal time, and it really helped me open up to being with that time.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I'm so glad that you're releasing it right now, re-releasing it under your name. So where can we find it, for folks that want to have the experience I had
Yeah.
with this music?
The album's called "See You in the Morning Light," and I'm re-releasing it under my own name, which is Scott Ferreter. And yeah, it's a really exciting time. I'm doing that kind of to tide everybody over until this great big Feelings Parade record, which you got to play on. We got
Thank you.
super blessed by the playing of Mazin on that. And I feel like just your presence over the course of the creation of that record, like you were so a part of it by the time you came in and played on it. It was like you were already in those songs.
Mm,
So yeah, those are the two ones under my own name, Scott Ferreter, and then the Feelings Parade.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, y'all heard it right here. The Feelings Parade, and you can find them on Instagram at
Yep.
the Feelings Parade.
Yep.
They got a really great Facebook situation going on. Lots of great conversations happening there.
Yeah.
And See You in the Morning Light,
Yep.
Scott Ferreter, and it's spelled just like it sounds.
Yeah.
Thank
And
you
if
so
if
much,
people
Scott.
follow the Feelings Parade, they'll get all the updates on that solo record when it comes out. So that's the way.
Right. Thanks for making it easy for us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for tuning in today to the Holistic Underground Podcast, Episode 1, with Scott Ferreter of the Feelings Parade, of You're Going to Die, of The Orchard. And y'all stay resilient out there. Hold on to your medicine, and let's alchemize the situation into something we're gonna use for the rest of our lives.
Yes.
Peace, brother.
Love you, brother. Thank you for having me.
Love you too.